All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to class. Professor G here. Today we are going to pick up where we left off last time. Last time, if you remember, we kind of finished up our discussion of the Civil War, focusing on kind of the political implications of the Civil War, what it would do to U.S. politics, what it did to U.S. politics, and today, what I want to do is to talk about the aftermath of the Civil War, focused on its impact on the American South, and also focused on the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendment. Now, I will begin by saying that this PowerPoint ought to be available to you through iCollege, so I would advise that you download it so that way you can kind of follow along with me. And so let's get started. All right. So let's talk about Southern culture, slavery, and the Civil War. Kind of a recap, a brief recap of what we talked about last time, so that way we can make sure that we're all on the same page here. So last time we talked about the political, economic, and even geographical reasons that sort of led in the 19th century, that led to the Civil War, that kind of built up to the Civil War. We talked about the divergence between the northern and southern economies. As you remember, with the northern economy being focused on industrialization, the northern economy being focused on things such as the production of natural resources, to be sure, but the North was also starting to adopt industrial factory systems, the factory system of labor, the adoption of wage-based labor. You're starting to, by the mid to late 19th century, you're starting to see textile factories appear in the North and major urban centers. And this is going to start the North down the line of industrialization that you see in its European counterparts at the time, which had readily adopted industrialization by this time. The South, however, from the get-go, going all the way back to the beginning of class, when we talked about the original 13 colonies, the South from the very beginning adopted an agricultural model for its economy, adopting the French plantation system that was implemented in the Caribbean. Southern aristocrats, Southern elites would make their money off of cash crops. We talked about how they started off with crops such as tobacco, of course, but by the 19th century, the Southern economy had shifted primarily to the production of cotton. As I said in class, by the beginning of the 19th century, the South was producing somewhere around 80% of the world's cotton production, cotton supply. All of this was, of course, was going to feed, was being grown in order to feed these textile mills of the North and also of European societies. Textiles being, of course, like clothing, cloth, bedding, all that good stuff, was a major market at the time. So already by the 19th century, we have a very, very big divide, economically speaking, divide that's happening between North and South. This is further exacerbated by the westward expansion under the Louisiana Purchase, which the United States, the territory of the United States, is basically tripled in size. The Louisiana Purchase bought by the American government from the French government under Napoleon. And the big question facing the Louisiana Purchase, of course, was the creation of new states and the political question of whether or not these new states were going to be free states or whether or not these new states were going to be slave states. So this leads us into events such as the Missouri Compromise, which we talked about last time, Bloody Kansas, which we talked about last time, all of which is kind of escalating tensions between northern and southern politicians, primarily over this issue of slavery. Of course, this comes to a head during the American Civil War, 1861. And it's during the Civil War that very important legislation is going to be passed through Congress. This kind of begins with Abraham Lincoln, who at the time had emergency war powers, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. which you've probably heard of before, the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves. This was eventually became a law, was passed through Congress towards the end of the Civil War, was passed through Congress by the Union, of course. The southern states at the time weren't participating, didn't have representatives in Congress. The 13th Amendment was passed, effectively ending slavery. And this is what it has to say, and I want to read it with you here. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. This will be important later, this exception here, especially with the documentary I'm going to have you watch. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, any place subject to their jurisdiction. So slavery, this is 1863, 1864, I think 64. Google me on that one. Slavery is ended with the 13th Amendment. Now, the Civil War ends 1864 with the surrender of the Confederacy. But here's the tricky thing about the Civil War. So there is a clear Union victory. The North clearly won, of course. We all know this. The United States of America became the United States of America once again. But just because the North won, and just because the 13th Amendment was passed, doesn't mean that slavery disappeared per se. As we'll see, one form of slavery is basically replaced by another form of slavery. And just because the North won didn't change the South's attitude and ideology and beliefs about slavery and about African Americans. And a really strange thing happened. So if you're a student of history, a student of world history, so the American Civil War represents a rebellion by the southern portion of the U.S., the continental U.S., against the North. Now, typically speaking, rebellions don't end this easily. Typically speaking, if a political group or political party rebels, of course, the American Civil War was very bloody, but once it came to an end, the South basically agreed to its surrender. And there wasn't fighting afterwards by Confederate soldiers, which is really, really strange for a Civil War. The reason for this, I think, the reason for this is because the people who were in charge in the South, the plantation owners, the politicians, the wealthy Southern aristocrats, their lives really didn't change. Now, to be clear, they endured a civil war, and there was catastrophic loss of life, damage of property, destruction of infrastructure, the burning down of cities. Yes, all of that happened. What I mean is the people who were in power before the Civil War remained in power after the Civil War. There were some attempts to change this, most famously by Union generals such as William Sherman. Sherman, for example, as he made his way through the South as a part of Abraham Lincoln's Anaconda Plan, the March to the Sea. Sherman splitting the South in half, right? As Sherman's going along, he's freeing slaves, and in some parts of the South, such as the city that I'm from, the city of Savannah, Sherman promises slaves the lands that they were once enslaved on, effectively taking the land from the plantation owners and giving it to the slaves. None of this happened, although it was promised. None of it happened. The North quickly realized that if they were going to get Southerners back into the Union, basically they're going to have to compromise on who's in charge and who's in power. So at the end of the Civil War, yes, slavery is ended, but those who were in charge in the South before are still in charge after. And the Southern mindset, Southern culture, Southern religion, Southern literature, Southern etiquette, that that's not going to end overnight. I have a few quotes here that you can look through at your own convenience, showing you kind of the mindset of the South. This is before this. Most all of these quotes are before the Civil War. Um, these are by two of them are by Southern politicians. One is by a Southern newspaper, outlining what I think is a good representation of the South's view on slavery. Did every Southerner think this way? Of course not. But this was the dominant opinion of Southerners prior to the Civil War. Um, I just want to read a quick quote from Lawrence Kett here. He's a congressman from South Carolina that kind of sums up what I think is the Southern attitude towards slavery, was the Southern attitude towards slavery. Africans, this is the very last quote, if you want to follow along. African slavery is the cornerstone of the industrial, social, and political fabric of the South. And whatever wars against it, wars against her very existence, the South's very existence. Strike down the institution of African slavery, and you reduce the South to depopulation and barbarism. What Kit is expressing here, a fact that I really want to emphasize, is that slavery inundated every aspect of Southern culture, the Southern psyche. It was at the bedrock, is at a foundational level of Southern civilization as a whole. So just because the South lost the war doesn't mean that it changed Southerners' mindset and political beliefs about African Americans. This sort of thing doesn't happen within a time span of 5 years. So what happens as a result is that those people in the South who were in charge, who were in power, remain in power. They're going to be integrated back into the Union, but as we'll see, they're going to take political steps and social steps as well to maintain Southern culture despite the institution of slavery ending, if that makes sense. So let's look at some examples. So after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson is the next president of the United States following Lincoln. Johnson, to be clear, Johnson was a Southerner. However, he was kind of shunned by Southern aristocratic society. As a result, he kind of had a prejudice against the wealthy Southern elite. But Johnson basically agreed with them, ideologically speaking, about things like slavery and the status of African Americans in the United States. Johnson wasn't really in support of emancipation per se. He wasn't really in support of granting African Americans the full rights of white citizens. However, Johnson, throughout his administration, is going to be at constant conflict with his Congress, which by 1865, 1866, the Congress of the United States, dominated primarily by the Republican Party. If you remember that we talked about in our last lecture, the Republican Party at the time was very much so of the abolitionist spirit. Abraham Lincoln, one of the platforms he ran on was abolitionism. This was a primary cause for the South splitting. The abolitionism and the belief of the Republican Party in abolitionism is going to be taken a step further after the Civil War. And you're going to see the passage of things like the Civil Rights Amendment and the 14th Amendment in spite of Johnson. Johnson will try to veto these laws, but Congress will override them, which I think is one of the very few times in U.S. history that Congress is able to override a presidential veto. I might be wrong about that. You might want to double check, but nevertheless, it's still really interesting. So, when I said that slavery ended, but it didn't really end, what I'm referring to uh, is is the economic model of sharecropping. You may or may not have heard about this before. So, in the South, right? The South, the primary economic institution is the plantation system. Plantation system, simply put, you have a very wealthy person who comes in, buys a bunch of land. The idea behind this is that he wants to make money, of course. How is somebody going to make money off of agriculture? You're going to grow cash crops such as cotton. Okay, so you buy the land, now you need labor in order to fund your project, and this is where the institution of slavery came in. Nothing much changes in the South following the Civil War in terms of its basic economy. The South before the Civil War is an agricultural based economy. The South after the Civil War will continue to be an agricultural based economy. The issue here revolves around the labor force, right? So after the Civil War, slavery is no longer legal, but you still need people to work those farms. So what happens as a result is sharecropping, which some would argue is just another form of slavery. And there might be good reasons to believe that. So slaves, as you know, were not paid, were not compensated for their labor in any way, shape, or form. They didn't really have possessions. They weren't really allowed to own land. They were not allowed to own land. Um, After the Civil War, that changes on paper. And this is what I mean by that. So let's take an example of you know, a hypothetical plantation. Um, we'll just say the acreage doesn't really matter, but a plantation growing cotton, right? So you need a labor force. So you hire in quotation marks, you hire 50 former slaves. So before, while they were slaves, you didn't have to pay them. Now you pay them. So you say, okay, I will pay you. You will get a percentage of the crop that I produce, or that you help to produce, that your labor helps to produce. So you work on the fields, you grow the crops. Once we sell it, I will give you a percentage of that money. Sounds like a pretty good deal. But here's the kicker. You're going to be living in a house that I provided. So every month, every day, however you want to take it, I'm going to have to take out rent from that percentage. I'm also feeding you, so I'm going to have to take out the consideration of your food from that rent as well, from that percentage as well. You're also working the land that I owned, so you're going to have to rent that land from me. So I'm going to have to take out a percentage of that from the overall check that you get as well. What eventually starts happen, what eventually happens is really a system in which, yes, these people are technically getting paid, but they're not like accumulating wealth like we would think of. They're not making money off of this really. And so you enter into a form really of like debt slavery, debt-based slavery, because the crops aren't always going to turn out. Maybe you incur some unexpected medical expenses, and the plantation owner has to call out a doctor to come see you and your family. All of that's coming out the paycheck. And so what happened with the sharecropping system, yes, it is now, you're now mandated by law to pay your African workers, but they're not really benefiting from that pay, if that makes sense. They're not, there's no social mobility here, right? We think of in the United States today, like the American dream, being able to climb up the economic ladder. That wasn't happening for these people. Okay, So you have the implementation of sharecropping as an economic system in the South. Um, this is followed by some very important legal changes that will have repercussions that will be felt all the way into the civil rights movement of the 20th century in the 1960s. So I think it's important for us to address these. The first is the 14th Amendment, followed by what are referred to as black codes, which are eventually become what's referred to as Jim Crow laws. So let's look at this for a second. So the 14th Amendment, another very famous amendment, still brought up a lot today. Um, Very quickly, all persons born or naturalized into the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Okay. Effectively, this made all former slaves citizens. And all of the former slaves who became citizens had access to the basic rights that at least in theory, they were supposed to have access to the same basic rights that other citizens, other white citizens, had at the time. It says later on down in the amendment, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Right? This effectively trying to eliminate discrimination, economic discrimination, um, judicial discrimination based on somebody's citizenship status, or deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. So theoretically speaking, again, this is theoretical because in practice it didn't really happen that way. But theoretically speaking, with the passage of the 14th Amendment, which is 1868-ish. Again, Google that date. I'm having a hard time with dates today. With the passage of the 14th Amendment, theoretically, you have the equality of former slaves under the law. These former slaves were supposed to have the same access and the same rights as white citizens. I say this is theoretical because in practice this didn't happen. And it didn't happen because of what's referred to as Black Code and eventually what's referred to as Jim Crow. Okay. A lot of the 14th Amendment was intentionally, I think, left vague. And as a result, a lot of the southern states took it upon themselves to pass their own sort of explanations or exemptions to the 14th Amendment. And what we're going to start to see here with beginning with Black Code is the beginning of what's usually referred to as segregation. So again, theoretically, they're supposed to African Americans are supposed to have the same rights under law, but of course, this isn't going to happen. So this is an example. We have two examples here. There's a lot of them. If you just Google Black codes from the American South, you can see laws that were passed. These are going to specifically target African Americans. And these are going to be like social restraints. So specifically voting restraints as well. So Southerners didn't really want African Americans, former slaves, voting. So a lot of laws are going to be passed targeting voting. So there's going to be laws, for example, where you're going to have like a poll tax. You have to pay a certain amount of money to vote. African Americans were predominantly very poor, again, from the sharecropping system. You're not accumulating a lot of wealth. So they're going to pass laws that are going to be aimed at trying to prevent people from voting. In addition to that, they're also going to pass laws to create a sort of separate society for former slaves. And you see an example of this in the Black Code. A very popular example that you see here is that basically speaking that a African American had to have proof of employment from a white employer. So African Americans walking down the street, a cop stops him, says, "What are you doing here? Why are you walking this way? Where are you going?" And it was expected that they had to have a good answer. Like, I'm going to work. I work on the corner of 5th and 6th Street. That's why I'm walking this direction. If they didn't, they could face legal repercussions. They could be arrested. They could be thrown in jail. So um, this is from the state of Louisiana, right? In the, I can't remember what city it's from, but state of Louisiana, basically stating that any African American needs a special permit from their employer in writing. Oftentimes, curfews were implemented for African Americans. They weren't allowed to go out past a certain time. Black codes also targeted um, African Americans congregating in public. The special exceptions were made for like church services and stuff like that, but they were very limited to when and where they could meet. This also targets housing, education, the types of schools. Separate facilities were expected between blacks and whites here. Even though black code ended, it's kind of the mantle is sort of picked up by Jim Crow. So this is an example of Jim Crow from the state of Missouri, which says that separate free schools shall be established for the education of children of African descent, and it shall be unlawful for any colored child to attend any white school, or any white child to attend a colored school. So this becomes a really big deal. At the very end of the 19th century, free public education is established. Universal education, which we are all familiar with, the K through 12 system, which is free for every U.S. citizen, free for everyone. One of the issues with the establishment of public education was where African Americans were going to go to school. And as you see here, a lot of Jim Crow laws targeted that. Basically, this is what creates segregated school systems. Okay, all of that leads us into the 20th century. And as I said before at the beginning, this isn't really going to be resolved for about another 60 years. So Jim Crow will still be very popular in the southern states and in the northern states. Segregation, slavery ends, of course, with the Civil War, but now segregation becomes the norm. Schools are segregated, workplaces are segregated, restaurants are segregated. We're seeing a fundamental division in Southern society between white culture and black culture. So, this mindset of the South before the Civil War that was predicated on slavery, which viewed African Americans as a form of less than human, this basic understanding is still carried over. It doesn't really change as a result of the outcome of the war. Um, so even with the major events that we're going to be talking about in the following lectures, such as World War I and World War II, as far as United States history is concerned, there's still this issue of, of, of segregation, of Jim Crow law, of separate but equal. All of these issues are looming in the background of American culture while these events are happening. And like I said, they won't really be resolved until the 1960s, until the Civil Rights Movement. All right, that's all I got for now. Again, the PowerPoint's available. Feel free to follow along, and I will see you next time. Bye.